Welcome to Pillow Talk tonight. We leave the hurried world behind and step softly into the hushed atmosphere of 1930s Surrey, where a magnificent country house holds a secret that is as quiet as it is deadly. Settle deep into your comfort. Let the rhythm of the words guide your breathing, and allow the meticulous mind of Hercule Poirot to lead us gently toward rest. Before we begin our journey, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. 1. The glimmer of trouble. The night at Blackwood Manor should have been utterly tranquil. A soft, pearl-white mist clung to the leaded windows, muting the world to a state of placid, velvet silence. It was the perfect picture of English country peace, disturbed only by the revelation that the master of the house, Lord Ashworth, a man obsessed with precision, had been found in his library. He was seated in his favourite leather chair, a half-empty glass of port on the table, and a look of profound, albeit gentle, surprise upon his features. But the true mystery was not the death itself, but the great-grandfather clock in the hall. It stood perfectly still, its chime, due at the hour of his passing, unheard. The silence itself was the crime. Hercule Poirot arrived by the morning train, the damp country air settling around his small, precise frame like a tailored coat. The journey itself had been a study in order, the wheels moving with a hypnotic, rhythmic clack-clack over the rails, perfectly conducive to quiet thought. He had used the time to contemplate the peculiar nature of the summons, a crime of quietude, involving a stillness so profound it could only be intentional. He hated disorder, and a silent timepiece was disorder incarnate. The steady movement of the train carriage, the smooth gliding of the countryside past the window, all served as a reassuring counterpoint to the impending chaos. He allowed his mind to drift, focusing only on the subtle pressure of the plush seat beneath him and the comforting low hum of the journey. Stepping onto the platform, he was met by the crisp, cool air of the Surrey countryside. The scent of pine and damp earth was a welcome change from the smoky bustle of London. The private motor car that carried him to Blackwood Manor navigated the narrow lanes with a slow, almost reverent pace. The long gravel drive crunched softly beneath his polished boots as he was escorted to the front door, the sound a fleeting disturbance in the prevailing quiet. The very structure of Blackwood Manor, a vast, dark-timbered house, seemed designed to absorb sound. It was ancient, heavy, and appeared to slumber deeply. The butler, Finch, an elderly man whose movements were as measured as a slow pendulum swing, met him with a dry whisper. Finch confirmed the details, his voice sounding like rustling parchment. Lord Ashworth had died around 3:15 a.m. Poirot was escorted into the grand entrance hall. It was a cavern of muted light and deep shadows, dominated by the magnificent grandfather clock. Crafted from dark, glowing mahogany, it was an imposing sentinel, yet utterly quiescent. Its elegant golden hands pointed perfectly to the fateful hour, 3:15. Such a stillness, n'est-ce pas? Poirot murmured, his eyes fixed on the motionless brass pendulum. The silence emanating from the clock was deep and unsettling, a void in the natural background hum of the house. A man who lived by the clock, betrayed by the clock. We must approach this case with the utmost tranquillity and the most patient observation. We must listen not for sound, but for the absence of sound. He spoke softly, consciously keeping his voice low, as if afraid to break a delicate spell. Poirot's mind, always hungry for symmetry, was already cataloguing the details of the hall. The dust motes dancing lazily in the slivers of weak sunlight, the perfect arrangement of the oriental rug, the scent of aged wood and beeswax. Everything spoke of wealth and fastidious care, a setting where chaos should be impossible. And yet, chaos, in its most insidious form, death, had visited. He noticed that the small bronze sculpture on the side table depicting the Greek god Kronos had been rotated slightly askew, a deviation of maybe half an inch, but enough to catch the eye of someone who craved visual order. He straightened it imperceptibly. The correction brought a small internal satisfaction. The scent that Poirot detected, a faint, sweet scent clinging to the clock's case, was not of polish or dust. It was something exotic, something floral and slightly spicy, a hint of clove and jasmine, a perfume entirely out of place in this austere setting. He filed this minute detail away. The human element, the flaw in the perfect mechanism, always manifested in the smallest deviations. His investigation would not begin with shouting, but with a quiet, meditative noticing of what was wrong, what was missing, and what was simply too neat. The manor was prepared to sleep, and Poirot would not disturb its rest, but merely examine its dreams. He adjusted his small, perfect bow tie, a final ritual of preparation. His little grey cells, his petites, cellules, grises, were stirring, waking from their gentle slumber. They sensed the puzzle was not one of brute strength, but of exquisite, almost musical subtlety. The killer had silenced not only a man, but the very passage of time itself, just for a moment. And Poirot, the great connoisseur of order, was determined to restore the rhythm. The rhythmic thump of his own heart, steady and slow, was already providing the only soundtrack to this hushed English tragedy. 2. The crime. discovered. The unnatural silence at Blackwood Manor, Poirot was led directly to the library, the scene where Lord Ashworth's life had concluded. The room was vast and comforting, lined floor to ceiling with thousands of volumes, smelling richly of leather and old paper. The light that filtered through the heavy velvet curtains was a bruised sepia colour, giving the room a deep, contemplative gloom. This was not a room for hurried activity. It was a sanctuary of slow, deliberate thought. The atmosphere was so thick with silence that even a whisper seemed too loud, too abrasive. The victim, Lord Ashworth, had been moved, but the layout of the scene was maintained. His favourite chair, a deep oxblood leather club chair, remained angled toward the unlit fireplace. The leather was still warm to the touch, a strange, lingering heat that suggested recent presence. On the small circular side table, a decanter of ruby red port stood beside a single glass, half full. The port in the glass was perfectly still, its surface reflecting the dim light like a tiny, unmoving mirror. It was the picture of a man relaxing into the night, perfectly at ease. Poirot approached the table with his characteristic measured gait. He studied the port glass. The residue was uniform, no sign of violent swirling or hurried drinking. Everything suggested peace. Yet the absence of life spoke of a calculated intrusion. The poison, the police doctor confirmed, was sophisticated. A lethal dose of an obscure, fast-acting barbiturate, likely mixed seamlessly into the port. A death that would have brought on a sudden, deep, and final sleep. The perfect crime for a sleep story, a quiet departure. The murderer, Poirot observed to the inspector, his voice a quiet drone, wished for two things: that the victim should die peacefully, and that the house should sleep through the event. The poisoning guarantees the first. The silencing of the clock guarantees the second. He noticed the inspector yawning, struggling against the heavy, soporific atmosphere of the manor. This quietude was a weapon in itself. He walked around the vast room, his eyes tracing patterns in the thick, woven Persian rug. He did not look for footprints. He looked for interruption. He noted the slight disarray on a secondary writing desk, an open ledger, and a stack of bills related to Lord Ashworth's recent, disastrous venture into the South American rubber market. The financial strain was evident, a silent but powerful motive for several people. In one corner, by a heavy globe stand, he noticed a tiny, almost invisible speck of white dust. Not ordinary house dust, but a fine, powdery mineral dust, slightly glittering. It was completely out of character with the rest of the room's pristine condition. He collected it into a small, waxed paper envelope, his movements almost meditative, savouring the tiny crunch of the paper as he sealed it. This detail, small as a single grain of sand, felt disproportionately important. The windows were locked from the inside. The heavy mahogany door was secured by a solid bolt. This was not a classic locked room mystery, but a locked house mystery, where the circle of suspects was confined to those within the estate's thick walls. Lady Clara, the young, financially strained widow, Elias Thorne, the desperate nephew, Mrs. Eleanor Vane, the obsessive guardian of the house, Finch, the meticulous butler, and Doctor Alistair, the visiting family physician who was known to have knowledge of rare chemical agents. The key to the puzzle must be the time, 3:15 a.m. The victim's routine was paramount. Lord Ashworth, obsessed with the correct measurement of time, took his port exactly at 3 a.m., always reading the paper until 3:15 a.m. At 3:15 a.m., the great hall clock would boom its resonant, midnight amplified chimes, confirming the turning of the night. Lord Ashworth would rise and go to the hall to confirm the clock's accuracy, performing his quiet vigil. The killer, therefore, had to act between 3 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. The poison had to be administered in that narrow window, and the clock silenced before 3:15 a.m. Otherwise, the great booming chime would have alerted the whole house to the victim's absence from his ritual, or to the killer's presence. Poirot returned to the side table, his eyes soft but piercing. He looked at the half-full glass of port. If the poison was taken at 3 a.m., and death occurred by 3:15 a.m., then the glass held the final critical piece of timing. The killer knew the routine intimately. The clock was stopped at 3:15 a.m., pointing to the moment the chime should have occurred. The killer intended to leave the time as a permanent testament to the quiet finality of the act. He closed his eyes for a long moment, allowing the profound quiet of the library to envelop him. He heard the distant wind sigh through the chimney, the faint drip of condensation outside, and nothing more. This silence was not a flaw in the plan. It was the plan itself, a deliberate, crafted quietude designed to send not just Lord Ashworth, but the entire house into a deep, long sleep of ignorance. The perfection of the silence was the greatest clue of all. The only way to achieve such comprehensive quiet was through preparation, intimate knowledge, and a lack of panic. The suspects were few, but their motives, like the clockwork gears themselves, were intricate and interconnected. He placed the evidence of the white dust and the port residue alongside his memory of the sweet perfume on the clock case. Two tiny deviations from the norm, two small hints of chaos in an otherwise perfect pattern of quiet. The stage was set. The suspects were waiting, and the slow, soothing process of deduction was about to begin. The rhythmic pulse of the investigation would now gently replace the heartbeat of the victim. The manor seemed to sigh contentedly as Poirot turned to face the door, ready to begin his soft, deliberate questioning. 3. Investigation begins. Introduction of the 5 suspects and the alibi. Webb Poirot established himself in the small, sun-drenched morning room, a place chosen specifically for its light and airiness, a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom of the library. Here he could observe the human mechanism with clarity. He had the inspector bring the 5 main inhabitants of Blackwood Manor to him, one by one. The first was Lady Clara Ashworth, the young widow. She entered the room wearing a gown of heavy, matte black silk, a garment that seemed designed to absorb every trace of light and emotion. Her beauty was undeniable, but fragile, like a piece of finely blown glass. Her grief was expressed with careful, almost professional moderation. Yet Poirot detected beneath the composure a subtle, trembling energy, a silent anticipation. Poirot began, his voice soft, almost a lullaby. Madame, your husband was a man of financial pressures, n'est-ce pas? And you, too, recently faced certain burdens? Clara admitted it immediately. Lord Ashworth was facing ruin in his South American ventures. He insisted on liquidating Blackwood. As for myself, she paused, her pearl necklace catching the light with a faint, hypnotic shimmer. I had a significant inheritance due next month. I used the expectation of that inheritance to settle a rather unfortunate gambling debt last week. Now, with his passing, the entire estate is mine, and free of his destructive impulses. Her motive was not the acquisition of wealth, but the preservation of self and home. She supplied her alibi. She had been sleepless, confined to her small writing desk from 1 a.m. until dawn, penning long, complicated letters to her solicitor. A soothing, repetitive task designed to distract a restless mind. Next came Elias Thorne, Lord Ashworth's nephew. He was a tall, angular man, whose clothes, though once fine, hung on him with the sad, crumpled look of neglected linen. He was restless and nervous, chain-smoking cheap cigarettes, the acrid scent temporarily cutting through the manor's dusty aroma. He was the picture of the frustrated heir, his desperation radiating from him like heat. He was going to ruin me, Thorne practically hissed, though he kept his voice low for the sake of decorum. He cut off my allowance. He knew I was penniless. He threatened to rewrite his will and donate everything to some obscure society for the preservation of rare stamps. I had everything to gain and nothing to lose by his survival, n'est-ce pas? His honesty was brutal, perhaps too honest. His alibi was a simple, miserable confession of his despair. He had been pacing his room, unable to sleep, staring at the moonlight, sometimes leaning out his window to draw a smoke. He had heard the distant creak of floorboards on the ground floor sometime around 3 a.m., but he dismissed it as the draft, or the old house settling. The third interviewee was Mrs. Eleanor Vane, the elderly cousin. She entered with the posture of a monarch defending her empty throne. She was the antithesis of Clara. Dressed in severe grey wool, her movements were slow, precise, and utterly unyielding. Her hands, when placed in her lap, were folded with the geometric precision of a military salute. Her motive was confirmed: the house itself. Lord Ashworth saw Blackwood as a ledger entry, Monsieur Poirot. I see it as a trust. To sell this house is sacrilege, she stated, her voice dry as autumn leaves. She admitted she had spent the previous evening reviewing old family documents in her room, a soothing ritual of remembrance. Her alibi was firm: a deep, dreamless sleep from 10 o'clock onwards. She was a perfect anchor in the storm of human emotion, completely untouched by the night's events. But Poirot remembered the faint oil smudge he thought he saw on her gloves. Was her stillness too perfect? Poirot then turned his attention to Finch, the butler. Finch was a mechanism himself, a man whose entire life was regulated by the dictates of service. He was impeccably starched and ironed, smelling faintly of lavender and old paper. He presented himself as a victim of Lord Ashworth's tyranny, yet fiercely loyal to the structure of the household. Finch described his routine with meticulous detail, checking the locks, ensuring the brandy was available, extinguishing the lights. He claimed to have retired to his remote basement room at 12:30 a.m. and to have woken only when the housemaid discovered the body at 7 a.m. I heard nothing, sir. The basement is deep and quiet. Too quiet, I suppose, he added, a hint of genuine sorrow in his voice. His motive remained elusive, perhaps a deep, quiet resentment of being a cog in Lord Ashworth's merciless clockwork life. Finally, there was Doctor Alistair, the family physician. He was staying at the manor to offer care to Mrs. Vane's recurring rheumatological complaint, an ailment he seemed to treat more as an interesting scientific problem than a source of pain. He was handsome, charming, and possessed an unsettling calm. He wore a quiet, self-assured smile, and his movements were exact, betraying the surgical precision of his profession. An appalling tragedy, Monsieur Poirot. Alistair sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. A barbiturate expertly administered. My own alibi is unfortunate but clear. I had an urgent call to the village to attend to a complicated birth. I left the house shortly after midnight and did not return until 4:00 a.m. I was miles away, struggling in the fog. He provided the name of the family and the local midwife. It was an alibi that gave him a perfect window of time before 3 a.m. and placed him back at Blackwood after the death was assumed to have taken place. But was it true? The gap in his alibi between 3:15 a.m. and 4 a.m. was the crucial period for a return to the manor and subsequent movement. Poirot thanked them all, noting the exhaustion settling on their faces. The rhythmic questioning, devoid of accusation, was draining them, forcing them into a state of quiet vulnerability. He dismissed them with a gentle wave of his hand. His web of alibis was complete, but like all human constructions, it was full of tiny, weak points. The faint creak, the quiet anticipation, the precise schedule, the sweet perfume. The mechanism of the crime was now fully assembled in his mind, though the identity of the engineer remained obscured. 4. Clues and red herrings. The missing key, the smudged ink, and the empty safe Poirot began the methodical search, a process he treated as a calming ritual. He was hunting for objects that should be present but were absent, or objects present but subtly altered. The small, telling flaws in the killer's meticulous construction. His first major find came in the narrow corridor outside Elias Thorne's room. Wedged deep within the thick pile of the carpet, Poirot found it. A small, silver-plated key, snapped cleanly in half. It was clearly the key to a delicate mechanism, its handle decorated with a tiny, stylized clock face. The break was sharp, suggesting brittle metal, but the key's overall appearance, its age and patina, suggested it had been broken long ago. Yet the placement was too deliberate, too neat, suggesting it had been placed there recently to be discovered. Voila, the first red herring, Poirot murmured, holding the broken piece up to the soft light. The key immediately pointed suspicion towards Thorne, the desperate nephew, suggesting he had attempted to access some clockwork safe or device late in the night. The break seemed to imply a forced entry, perhaps driven by panic. But Poirot noted the clean line of the break. It was almost surgical, not the jagged tear of hurried force. He placed the key carefully in an envelope, noting the faint metallic smell it carried, distinct from the polish and age. Next, he considered Lady Clara's alibi. He acquired the letters she claimed to have penned between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. The handwriting was elegant, but the third letter, the one dated 3 a.m., contained a crucial defect. The final paragraph, a precise instruction to her solicitor, showed clear evidence of smudged ink. The pen strokes blurred slightly, as if the writer had suddenly stopped, perhaps leaping up from the desk, and accidentally dragged her wrist across the fresh ink. A tiny, almost imperceptible smudge that contradicted her claim of serene, continuous writing. The writer was interrupted. Poirot concluded softly, running his fingertip along the paper, careful not to disturb the smudge further. Interrupted, or forced to leave her task with haste at precisely the time the poisoning took place. An excellent alibi, if not for this minute, telling detail of human haste. The smudge was a quiet scream of interruption, a silent witness to a disturbed timeline. The third significant discovery was made back in the library, in the study next to the globe stand, where the white dust had been found. Hidden behind a row of seldom-read financial volumes was a heavy, old-fashioned steel safe. It was open. The lock was undamaged, suggesting the use of a key or known combination. Yet, it was completely empty. The local police had assumed a robbery gone wrong, connecting the empty safe to Thorne's desperation. But Poirot found the scene too theatrical. Why leave the safe wide open but undamaged? A professional thief would be more discreet. A panicked thief might smash the lock. This felt like a deliberate presentation. Furthermore, the contents of the safe, mainly old, non-negotiable bonds and family deeds, were only valuable to Lord Ashworth himself or his heirs. If the motive was robbery, why leave the real prize, the manor itself, now inherited by Clara, behind? Poirot dismissed the robbery theory. The safe was meant to suggest a theft motive, just as the broken key was meant to point to Thorne's panic and the smudged ink to Clara's haste. These were all red herrings, beautifully crafted to occupy the dull minds of ordinary investigators. But the empty safe did contain one final, crucial piece of information. Inside, on the smooth, polished steel of the back wall, was a faint, almost invisible scratch, no more than a hair's width. It was a precise, angled mark, almost mathematical in its execution, placed exactly where the safe's former contents, a stack of ledgers, would have pressed against the wall. A scratch, Poirot whispered, closing the heavy steel door gently, the sound of the tumblers falling into place a reassuring click. Not a flaw of violence, but a mark of measurement. The scratch suggested someone had been measuring the space, perhaps to replace the contents with something else, or to ensure the old ledgers would no longer fit. The idea that someone was concerned with the exact physical dimensions of the contents, a new line of thought altogether, intrigued him. He now had 4 critical objects: the faint, exotic perfume on the great hall clock, the white mineral dust by the globe, the broken surgical key, and the mathematical scratch inside the safe. None of these pointed clearly at a killer, but all pointed to a person obsessed with precision, measurement, and the subtle manipulation of physical evidence. The rhythm of the investigation slowed deep into the contemplation of these mute witnesses. 5. Complications and twists. The second silent clock, a duplicate clue. The atmosphere within Blackwood Manor was growing heavier, the silence more oppressive. The suspects, confined to the house, moved like figures in a slow-motion dream, their nerves frayed by Poirot's gentle persistence. They longed for sound, for action, for anything to break the methodical calm of his investigation. Poirot, meanwhile, was exploring the furthest, seldom used wing of the manor, a place Lord Ashworth had reserved for his eccentric hobby, horology. Lord Ashworth wasn't merely a fan of clocks. He was a serious amateur clockmaker, and this small, isolated room was his horologist's study. The room itself was a masterpiece of miniature chaos. Every surface was covered in brass gears, tiny springs, tweezers, and magnifying lenses. The smell here was strongly metallic, mixed with the sharp scent of lubricating oil and specialized cleaning spirits. And there, on a workbench near the window, Poirot found his twist, a second clock. This was not a grand piece of furniture, but a small, intricate table clock, designed as a highly complex working model of the great hall clock. It was, in essence, a miniature duplicate, and like its majestic counterpart, its hands pointed perfectly to 3:15 a.m. Poirot sat on the nearest stool, which creaked softly under his weight, and studied the miniature clock. Ah, magnifique, he breathed, a smile, not of pleasure, but of intellectual satisfaction, playing on his lips. The duplication. The killer does not simply stop the time. The killer frames the time. They needed 3:15 a.m. to be the immutable, non-negotiable truth of the moment of death. He reasoned that silencing the hall clock merely masked the sound of the chime. But stopping both clocks at the precise moment of Lord Ashworth's final routine suggested a deeper obsession with establishing an exact timeline that could be traced back to a specific, unassailable point in time. The killer was planting an alibi not for themselves, but for an event. He gently opened the rear casing of the miniature clock. The mechanism inside was extraordinarily delicate. He noted that this clock, too, had a flaw, a small, almost invisible scorch mark near the mainspring, suggesting a brief, localized application of extreme heat or a strong chemical. This small detail connected the clock to the library, where the sophisticated poison was used, hinting at the killer's scientific background. The discovery of the duplicate clock complicated the suspect list immensely. It eliminated those who might have acted impulsively, like Thorne, or emotionally, like Mrs. Vane, and focused suspicion entirely on individuals with intimate mechanical or scientific knowledge and access to specialized tools. The list now refined itself. Dr. Alistair possessed the chemical knowledge for the poison and the steady hands for the delicate sabotage. His alibi, returning at 4 a.m., now had to account for stopping 2 clocks and poisoning the victim between 3 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. Finch the butler, though professionally rigid, his constant maintenance of the house might include knowledge of the hall clock's simple inner workings, though not necessarily the duplicate's complex mechanism. Lord Ashworth himself. Could this be a meticulously planned suicide designed to look like a murder? Poirot quickly dismissed this. The profound surprise on Ashworth's face negated the idea of a self-inflicted end. Furthermore, the broken winding key found near Thorne's room, Chapter 4, was definitely not from this miniature clock. It was far too large. Poirot turned his attention to the workbench. He noticed a jar containing the white, glittering mineral dust he had found on the globe stand in the library. This dust was clearly jeweler's rouge, a type of specialized polishing compound used by watchmakers for fine brass work. This confirmed 2 things. The killer had been in this study before or immediately after the crime. They had attempted to clean or polish something metallic, the broken key perhaps, to conceal evidence of manipulation. He closed the door to the horologist's study, the soft thud resonating in the empty corridor. The tension in the house was now unbearable, and Poirot knew the meticulous calm of one of the inhabitants was about to break. He had given them enough time to consider their lies, and the time had come for a new approach, a calming, therapeutic pressure designed to coax the truth out of the silence. The rhythmic pulse of the inquiry was about to accelerate, ever so slightly. 6. The quiet confession. A suspect admits to lying, not murder. The next morning was grey and damp, the atmosphere perfectly suited to introspection and regret. Poirot sat sipping his perfectly measured coffee, enjoying the soothing sound of the rain against the window panes. He had summoned Finch, the butler, back to the morning room, not to accuse, but to offer a chance for a quiet correction. Finch, Poirot began, his voice barely above a whisper. You are a man of order, a man who lives by the clock, perhaps more than Lord Ashworth himself. Last night, you told me you retired at 12:30 a.m. and never left your basement room until 7 a.m. That is a beautiful, perfect statement. But n'est-ce pas? Is it not too perfect? Finch's rigid composure, which had held up against 2 days of police presence, finally fractured. His hands, resting on his starched trousers, trembled visibly. The sound of the falling rain seemed to amplify the quiet shame in the room. Sir, Monsieur Poirot, I must confess to a grave fault, Finch whispered, his voice catching. I did leave my room, but not to commit murder. I was compelled to retrieve a book. He explained that Lord Ashworth, shortly before 1 a.m., had been engaged in a furious argument with Mrs. Vane about the family's book of historical deeds. Ashworth, in a fit of pique, had retrieved the rare book from the safe, the empty one Poirot found in the library, and had thrown it onto a high shelf in the dining room, demanding Finch return it to the library's secure storage immediately. It was not about the book's value, sir, Finch explained, his shame deep. It was about his tyranny. He knew I was terrified of heights, but he insisted the deed be done immediately. He watched me climb the ladder. I waited until I heard him return to the library before moving again. Finch confessed that he had retrieved the book at approximately 1:15 a.m., but instead of returning it to the safe, he had carried it to his remote basement room. I intended to keep it safe until morning, but in my haste, I realized I had left the safe door slightly ajar. I crept back up to the library just before 2 a.m. to close the safe door. This confession was a valuable piece of the puzzle, even if it did not reveal the killer. It established several key facts. Finch's alibi was broken, but he was innocent of the murder, which occurred hours later. His motive was fear and protection of family heritage, echoing Mrs. Vane's motive. The safe was open at 2 a.m., confirming the killer did not need to force it open at 3:15 a.m. to place or remove a clue. A specific scuff mark on the library floor, which Poirot had noticed near the safe, was now explained as Finch's careful, silent movement. He had tried to polish it away that morning, but failed. Poirot closed his notebook gently, the light thud confirming the end of this line of inquiry. Thank you, Finch. The truth, even partial truth, restores the order of the timeline. Your small disobedience clears you of the great crime. You were concerned with a book. The killer was concerned with a number. The significance of Finch's movement, climbing, hiding, creeping back to close a safe, was that it proved silent, measured movement was possible within the manor without waking the household, provided the main hall clock was not chiming. This confirmed the killer's basic premise that the only threat to their silent operation was the 3:15 a.m. chime and Lord Ashworth's subsequent movement toward the hall. The air in the morning room felt slightly lighter, the rain outside a little more soothing. A piece of the human puzzle had been gently, therapeutically separated from the core of the mystery. Poirot was left with 3 prime suspects: Lady Clara, Elias Thorne, and Doctor Alistair, all of whom still had a weak alibi and strong motive, but only one of whom possessed the technical skill necessary for the quiet sabotage of 2 clocks and the administration of a rare poison. 7. The hidden mechanism. Poirot realizes. The crime is a locked time mystery. Poirot retired to the horologist's study, Chapter 5, the room of gears and oils, for deep contemplation. He placed the key piece of evidence on the workbench, the broken, silver-plated winding key. It was the key that had been intended to mislead the police into suspecting a panicked robbery by Thorne. He took a specialized jeweler's loop, one of Lord Ashworth's own tools, and carefully examined the breakpoint. It was not jagged, but smooth, almost cut. Furthermore, the break was not at the square end that engages the winding peg, but slightly further up the shaft, where the key would be at its most vulnerable to lateral stress, not rotational torque. The key was not used to force a lock, Poirot whispered to himself, adjusting the loop until the fractured metal was perfectly sharp. It was used to snap a delicate part. He turned his attention back to the great hall clock, the beautiful, massive timepiece that stood silent downstairs. He remembered the police doctor's report. Lord Ashworth died between 3 a.m. and 3:15 a.m. The killer had to silence the clock before 3:15 a.m. to prevent the chime from alerting the house to the movement required for the crime. However, the clock's hands were frozen at 3:15 a.m. Poirot realized the crucial distinction that every ordinary investigation had missed. The chime mechanism, the sound, and the time mechanism, the hands, are slightly different systems within a long case clock. The chime is triggered by a lever that falls when the clock reaches the hour. If the killer had merely jammed the chime hammer, a cruder method, the hands would still have moved on, reaching 4 a.m., 5 a.m., and so on until the discovery. But the hands were stopped. This meant the entire gear train that drives the minute and hour hands had been sabotaged. Poirot gently opened the lower panel of the great clock. He did not touch the intricate brass gears, but looked down into the space where the heavy pendulum weights descended. There, hidden from casual sight, was a critical, small counterweight lever, a delicate piece of steel that regulated the tension on the minute hand. This lever had a tiny point of engagement, a minuscule square peg, normally protected by the clock's frame. He placed the broken winding key next to the slot. The geometry was perfect. Mon Dieu! Poirot exclaimed quietly. The key was not used to wind. It was used as a lever to break the counterweight mechanism. The killer had used the broken key as a specialized, disposable tool. They pushed the end of the key into the access point and applied lateral force, snapping the counterweight lever. The result? The hands froze at 3:15 a.m. The clock was silenced, not by muffling the sound, but by locking the time itself. The killer had left a permanent, deliberate timestamp of the murder, a beautiful, perfect piece of clockwork sabotage. This realization changed everything. The crime was not about masking sound. It was about creating a false, frozen truth at 3:15 a.m. The final suspects were Lady Clara, no mechanical skill; Elias Thorne, no mechanical skill despite the key being placed near him; and Doctor Alistair. The doctor, with his surgical precision, steady hands, and inherent understanding of mechanisms and complex systems, was the only one who could have executed such a delicate, precise piece of sabotage in the dark in a matter of seconds. The broken key, the white mineral polishing dust, the precise poison, all pointed to an individual who treated murder as an exercise in mechanics. The locked time mystery was finally unlocked. 8 final interrogations, narrowing the focus to knowledge of the clock's routine. With the mechanism of the crime understood, Poirot required only the motive and the final proof. He discarded the red herrings, the empty safe and the smudged ink, and focused on the two individuals who retained both motive and ability: Mrs. Vane and Doctor Alistair. Mrs. Vane's ability was limited to the history of the clock, Doctor Alistair's to its engineering. Poirot recalled the two minor but important physical deviations he had catalogued. The white mineral dust, jeweler's rouge, from the horologist's study, found on the library floor, chapter 2 and 5, and the exotic perfume, clove and jasmine, detected on the great hall clock's casing, chapter 1. He first summoned Mrs. Vane, speaking with deliberate slowness, making her feel the weight of his gentle scrutiny. He engaged her on the topic of the clock's history. Madame Vane, you know this timepiece well. Could you describe for me the workings of the counterweight system and how the minute hand is tensioned? Is it a single gear or a differential chain? Mrs. Vane looked pained. Monsieur Poirot, I know its soul. I know it chimed for my grandparents' wedding. I know its story, the brass and gears. That is my cousin's obsession, not mine. I would never defile its beauty by tampering with the mechanism. I care only for its history, not its engineering. Her denial was emotionally truthful, and Poirot dismissed her gentle, her innocence confirmed by her lack of technical vocabulary. Now only Doctor Alistair remained. Poirot had him wait in the hall, directly next to the massive, silent clock. The doctor stood straight, emanating a calm confidence that bordered on arrogance. Poirot entered the room, holding the small waxed paper envelope containing the white mineral dust, and another containing traces of the obscure poison. He did not greet the doctor, but pointed to the clock. Dr. Alistair, you have the steady hands of a surgeon and the precise mind of a chemist. You told me you returned at 4 o'clock after attending to a difficult birth in the village. A strenuous night, n'est-ce pas? Yet I find on the floor of the library where you would have passed traces of this. Poirot opened the envelope slightly, letting the faint, glittering dust catch the light. Jeweller's rouge, a specialized polishing agent only found in Lord Ashworth's private workshop. Alistair did not flinch. I assure you, monsieur, I have no knowledge of clock repair. I deal in human mechanisms. Poirot smiled, a thin, pitying expression. But you deal in cover-ups, Doctor. This dust was used to clean a piece of metal, a broken key, perhaps, to make it appear old and rusted. And what of this? Poirot leaned close to the doctor, who carried a faint clinical scent of antiseptic. The hall clock smells faintly of clove and jasmine, an unusual choice for Blackwood Manor, but a necessary one, I think. Poirot explained. The sophisticated barbiturate poison used was administered in a small, concentrated dose. It required a powerful, pungent solvent to ensure the powder dissolved completely and quickly into the cold port, masking the taste. The scent of that solvent was often powerful and lingering. The exotic clove and jasmine perfume was used by the killer to mask the chemical odor that would have otherwise clung to the clock casing after they had performed the sabotage. The perfume was the doctor's, a gift to Mrs. Vane from him the previous week. He had used her cheap perfume bottle to hide the solvent scent on his own hands, and it had transferred to the polished mahogany of the clock. Alistair finally dropped his composure, the mask of calm falling away, revealing a desperate, calculating mind. You cannot prove the motive. It was just debt. Nothing more. Poirot shook his head. The murder was not about debt, Doctor. It was about silencing a far greater truth. The clock's silence was a distraction. The real silence was that of Lord Ashworth's tongue. 9. The revelation, order and method, the exposure of the true motive. The suspects, Clara, Thorne, Mrs. Vane, and Finch, were assembled in the library, standing under the dark, heavy silence of the room. Doctor Alistair stood apart, near the fireplace, his face pale but resigned. Poirot began his slow, deliberate summation, walking slowly around the room, making eye contact with each person, drawing them gently into his intricate web of logic. The crime, mes amis, was one of order corrupted by precision. The murderer was a master of mechanisms, both human and mechanical. The poison was rare and required expertise. The clock sabotage required the steadiest of hands and a deep knowledge of horology. He revealed the locked time mechanism, Chapter 7. The use of the broken key to snap the counterweight lever, freezing the hands at 3:15 a.m. This was not to hide the crime, but to fix a false time in the minds of the police. Why fix 3:15 a.m.? Because the killer needed an ironclad alibi for the crucial hour of 4:00 a.m. Poirot explained that the doctor's alibi, returning from the village birth at 4:00 a.m., was true. But he failed to mention a critical detail. The birth had actually been concluded at 2:00 a.m. The doctor did not return at 4:00 a.m., but was free to return after 2:00 a.m. He returned to Blackwood Manor in the deep of the night, poisoned Lord Ashworth at 3:00 a.m., and then, using his specialized knowledge, sabotaged both the hall clock and the small study clock at 3:15 a.m. Why? Poirot asked the room, pausing for a long, dramatic moment. The money motive was a distraction. The true motive lay in a specific secret Lord Ashworth held. Poirot produced a single old newspaper clipping found pressed inside the empty safe's original ledger, the one Finch retrieved. It was an obituary for a young woman who had died during a routine surgery conducted by Doctor Alistair 5 years prior. Lord Ashworth did not merely lend Doctor Alistair money. He discovered evidence that the doctor was responsible for a major medical malpractice cover-up. Lord Ashworth was preparing to expose him, not to the police, but to the Royal College of Surgeons, which would mean ruin and disgrace. The white mineral dust, jeweller's rouge, was then explained. Alistair, realizing the key might be traced, brought it to the horologist's study, polished it with the rouge to remove fingerprints and make the break look older, and then planted it near Thorne's room to direct suspicion. The perfume masked the chemical solvent used to dissolve the poison. Lord Ashworth was going to destroy Alistair's life and reputation. The doctor's final act was to turn his fate into a mechanism of time. He didn't just kill Lord Ashworth. He destroyed the exact time of death, replacing it with a neat, surgical illusion. He needed the police to believe the crime occurred at 3:15 a.m., giving him the perfect travel time to return and appear innocent at 4:00 a.m. Alistair, defeated by the gentle but relentless logic, bowed his head. The perfect order of your mind, Poirot, is unbearable. You noticed the smell. You noticed the dust. 10. Justice served and resolution, peaceful conclusion, and Poirot's final thoughts on time. The room settled into a new, complex silence, following the doctor's subdued acceptance of his fate. The inspector led Alistair away, the sound of the car fading slowly into the damp countryside mist. The residents of Blackwood Manor were left with the aftermath, the slow, gradual realization that the source of their quiet chaos had been removed. Poirot stayed behind for a final, meditative hour in the hall, sitting before the great mahogany clock. The silence was now different. It was no longer the oppressive quiet of concealment, but the restorative calm of an empty stage, ready for the next act. Lady Clara approached him, her black silk gown catching the minimal light. "It is strange, Monsieur Poirot. I loved him not, but his obsession with time was the only consistent rhythm in my life. Now even the clock is silent." "The silence is only temporary, madame," Poirot assured her, his voice a warm, gentle rumble. "Order can always be restored, but it requires patience and a good measure of logic." Poirot had brought with him a specialized horologist from London. Under Poirot's careful, observant eye, the expert worked slowly, meticulously replacing the delicate counterweight lever and the small section of the gear train that Alistair had broken. The process was unhurried. Each tiny click and scrape of the repair process, a soothing sound of rebuilding. As the final screws were tightened, the pendulum was given a gentle swing. It began its rhythmic, hypnotic sweep, a soft, reassuring tick-tock, tick-tock, that immediately filled the cavernous hall. The sound was not loud, but utterly pervasive, a heartbeat returning to the house. Poirot watched the golden hands creep slowly toward the next hour. He reflected on the nature of time, how a man could live his life in perfect, measured blocks, yet be destroyed by a single, calculated moment of sabotage. The killer had sought to control not just Ashworth's end, but his legacy, fixing his final moment forever at 3:15 a.m. But time, Poirot mused, cannot be frozen by human hands. Flows, it forgives, and it eventually reveals all. He addressed the remaining members of the household, his voice carrying the final message of the tale. "The crime was one of extraordinary order. But you see, mes amis, the perfect crime is the one that contains too much order, too much logic. It is the small flaw, the smudge of ink, the grain of dust, the inappropriate scent of jasmine that reveals the chaos within the human heart. To seek perfect order in a human act is to seek the impossible, for humanity itself is a magnificent, flawed mechanism, constantly prone to deviation. As he finished speaking, the clock reached the designated hour. With a deep, resonant whir that signaled its readiness, and then a magnificent, authoritative, and profoundly calming gong. The great-grandfather clock chimed the hour of 4. The sound resonated through the house, a powerful, steady declaration of truth and continuity, signaling that the unnatural silence was finally over. The rhythm of Blackwood Manor had been restored. And now, mon ami, the mystery is solved, the disorder is put right, and the time has come for your own quiet vigilance to cease. Let the soothing, rhythmic tick-tock of the restored clock and the profound peace of a mechanism working in perfect harmony accompany you now into a deep, long, and tranquil sleep. Good night.